Appreciate that introduction, and I appreciate very much your presence. Tonight we want to consider the fruit of the Spirit. We're going to broaden that out to consider the broader context in which this particular matter is discussed. If you have your Bibles, please open to Galatians chapter 5. In just a few moments we will begin reading in verse 16. Galatians chapter 5, beginning verse 16. You know, life presents us with a number of major moments. There's, of course, birth, the first word that is spoken by a child, first day in school, first car, first date. Later on in life, there is marriage, and then children that are born and grandchildren, a number of major moments in life. One of those comes very early on in life, the first step that is taken. I suppose that nothing thrills parents any more than watching a child, he or she, take that first step and begin to learn how to walk. Now, of course, that learning process is a struggle. There are a lot of hard falls involved in that. A lot of times when you have to pick the child up and help them move along again and try it again. It's a struggle. It's a process. It's a learning experience, but it's something that we must do if we are to learn how to walk in this life. What is true physically is also true spiritually. In a spiritual sense, we must learn how to walk. Very often in the pages of the New Testament, the Christian life is described as a walk. And it is a struggle, isn't it? It involves some ups and downs. And in Galatians chapter 5, Paul zeroes in on this particular struggle, this challenge that we have to walk as God would have us to walk. In the midst of this particular discussion, he introduces this beautiful figure of speech called the fruit of the Spirit. And he talks about the dimensions there. But what I want us to see this afternoon as we study this together is that the fruit of the Spirit is directly connected to this Christian walk of ours. In fact, it's in this broader context of a Spirit-filled walk, a walk that leads first of all to spiritual victory, and a walk that results then in this spiritual fruitfulness that we call the fruit of the Spirit. So that's what we want to look at. Let's familiarize ourselves again with the text. I'll begin reading Galatians chapter 5, verse 16. But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. For the flesh sets its desire against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. For these are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, outburst of anger, disputes, dissensions, factions, envying, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these, of which I forewarn you, just as I forewarned you, that those who practice such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. Now those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also walk by the Spirit. A Spirit-filled walk. What we intend to do this afternoon is to look at this passage and see how that God calls us to a Spirit-filled walk that results first of all in spiritual victory and secondly, in spiritual fruitfulness. First of all, spiritual victory. In verses 16 through about verse 21, we discover this. Paul makes a powerful promise, a wonderful promise in verse 16. He says, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. He guarantees us spiritual victory. These are words of conquest and triumph. It is an apostolic promise that says to us that while we are walking by the Spirit, we shall be spiritually invincible. Paul essentially says that there's no possible way in the world that you can experience ultimate spiritual defeat if your life is made after the pattern of a Spirit-filled walk. Now this walk, as we said earlier, is not without a struggle. It is in fact a battle. It's a warfare. It's a conflict. It is a struggle all the way. And yet it is one in which we can be victorious. The fact that it is a struggle is pointed out in verse 17, where it says, the flesh sets itself against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, for these are in opposition to one another. There is a war that is raging within us, and it involves two opposing forces. On the one hand, there is the flesh, and on the other hand, the Spirit. Now, what does Paul mean by these? By flesh, Paul uses a term that's found many times in his letters, and he uses it with a variety of meanings. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he uses the word flesh to just simply describe our mortal flesh, our mortal bodies. Over in Galatians chapter 2, he uses in verse 16 this to describe the total person. In another passage, Romans chapter 4, it describes earthly descent, our ancestors. But here in this passage, as is the case in many other passages in the Pauline writings, he uses this word flesh, or the Greek word sarx, to describe the ultimate enemy in the warfare of the soul. That enemy that is within us. It is while we are in the flesh that we find ourselves opposed to the will of God for our lives. Over in Romans chapter 7, verse 18, Paul notes there that nothing good dwells in the flesh. For you see, the flesh represents everything that would command our ultimate trust apart from God, our ultimate commitment apart from God. It is every tendency, every desire, every impulse, every inclination which leads to conduct that is contrary to the will of God. Now, where does this flesh come from? How does it appear in our lives? Well, it seems to me the Bible teaches it's not something that we inherit. It's not through genes that we get this sort of flesh. But this is something that is acquired in a world that is filled with sinful and rebellious people. It is the environment in which we find ourselves, the world in which we find ourselves, which basically is in opposition to the will of God, that places constant pressure upon us to conform our ways to its ways. So that we are constantly trained and pressured to run our own lives, to satisfy our own desires, to serve our own selves in ways that run contrary to the nature and to the will of God Himself. Flesh is not something that is inherited. It is something which we acquire, but which leads to a life that is self-willed, that is self-destructive, and completely offensive to God. And if you'll notice in the context here, it leads to some pretty horrible things. In verse 19, the deeds of the flesh are these: immorality, impurity, sensuality. So many of the things that God has given to us in this world that could be used for good, when they're used for the flesh, when they're used for self, when they're guided by a will that is opposed to the will of God, they become all sorts of sordid sins and evil deeds. The flesh is within each of us as Christians. It will be there until the day that you die on this earth. And it is that beachhead within us that Satan uses to try to establish some control at various points in our lives. Now, the other power that is at work within us, though, as Christians, Paul describes as the Spirit, which is none other than the Spirit of the living God that dwells within us. In Acts chapter 2, verse 38, we are told that God sends the gift of His Spirit into our lives when we turn to Him in belief and repentance and baptism into Christ. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 6, we're told that because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of His sons into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. God lives within us. In fact, Paul rather boldly states in Romans chapter 8, verse 9, that without this Spirit within us, we are not genuinely Christians. It is this indwelling Spirit that brings peace to our lives. Romans chapter 8, verse 6, and He is the one that empowers us to put to death the deeds of the body. Romans chapter 8, verse 13. Why does God send His Spirit to dwell within us? Well, God seeks more than just to save us in Christ. He seeks to make us like Christ. And that is the work of the Spirit within us. As the Spirit indwells us, it seeks to use the Word, it seeks to use our prayer lives, it seeks to use every spiritual resource at the Spirit's disposal to try to form us into the image of the Lord Jesus Christ Himself. Now, through this whole process, the Spirit is resisted. Resisted by that flesh that is already abiding within us. And so we have these two forces that constantly contend for the complete control of the Christian. On the one hand, there is the Spirit that attempts to resist the flesh, and on the other hand, there is the flesh that stands against the Spirit. And ultimately, it is the Christian who must decide to whom he will give his allegiance, to whom he will surrender himself. And that is why Paul exhorts us in Galatians chapter 5, verse 16, walk by the Spirit, make that choice, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. If a Christian consistently surrenders his life to the direction of the Spirit, he will resist and will conquer the flesh. Someone says, well, what actually does it mean, though, to walk by the Spirit? That's rather strange terminology. Again, I think Paul perhaps best defines this himself in the same letter, Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. When he wrote, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. We walk by the Spirit when we yield ourselves, our talents, our possessions, our goals, our priorities, our relationships to others, and everything else, and every other aspect of our lives to the Lord Jesus Christ. When we really let Him begin living out His life through us, then we are walking by the Spirit. And when that happens, you become like Christ. He lives His life in you, and you experience real victory in the spiritual battle that rages within. In the June 1986 issue of National Geographic, there was a fascinating story there about our immune system. The title of the story was, Our Immune System, The Wars Within. It told something about the constant conflict that goes on 24 hours a day in our physical bodies. We're told that we have about 1 trillion white blood cells that are like a specialized army. And every sort of bacteria and every sort of virus and other type of disease organism that might invade our body is likewise resisted by this immune system that we have, this army that we have within. And right now, within every one of us, there is a war raging. It is an invisible one and an internal one, but it's a real war on the inside. Now, what Paul is telling us in Galatians chapter 5 is that there is another war going on within us that is just as real as that physical warfare of our bodies. It is a spiritual warfare, a warfare between the flesh and the Spirit. Now let me ask you, are you overcoming in that warfare? Are you experiencing victory in the battle within? Are you walking by the Spirit? Have you given every part of your life to Jesus Christ, or does He just have control over those areas that are convenient for you to surrender to Him? I'm afraid that far too often we at times reach a comfort zone or a toleration zone in which we surrender some areas of our life to His Lordship. We let Him control this area. That's easy for me to give up. And it's easy for me to give up this area. But this area is a different matter. And so I withhold that from His control. I don't submit that to Him. What Paul is calling upon us to do is to surrender every single area of our lives to the Lord Jesus Christ. And so this afternoon we would ask the question, where does the flesh still have its camp in your life? Does the flesh rule first thing Monday morning? Does it control your behavior at the office or at school or at home? Does the flesh still have a beachhead of operation in the value that you attach to money or to the kind of car that you drive or to the position that you seek or to the clothes that you wear? Where does the flesh have a stronghold within you? Because you see, within every one of us there are those areas, aren't there? Places where Satan still has a beachhead of operation, that flesh, where the spirit and the flesh struggle. And Paul says as plainly as he knows how, don't let the flesh get control. Surrender to the Spirit. And when you do that, in those areas, you will experience spiritual victory. Now that's part of that Spirit-filled walk. The spiritual victory when we surrender, genuinely surrender every area of life to the Lord. But what else do we find when we surrender? What else do we find in this Spirit-filled walk? It brings us to verse 22 and verse 23, the fruit of the Spirit. God calls us to a Spirit-filled walk that produces spiritual fruit. Now this phrase, the fruit of the Spirit, before we look at the individual aspects of this, let's think about that phrase. And just three observations on that fruit of the Spirit. First of all, I want you to observe, it is the fruit of the Spirit, not the Christian. The fruit of the Spirit. It would make just as much sense for me to argue that an apple branch can produce its own fruit apart from the tree as it would for me to say that a person could produce the kind of qualities of life that we're talking about here apart from the Spirit. In fact, Jesus Christ himself said in John chapter 15, verse 5, I am the vine and you are the branches. Remember that relationship. He who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing. These are not qualities that you can just produce in your life of your own grim determination. You may in some way produce something that looks like or in some ways resembles what we're talking about here, but unless the Spirit of the living Lord is actually producing these in your life, you can't have these qualities that Paul writes about in these verses. It is the fruit of the Spirit, produced by the Spirit in the Christian. Secondly, the fruit is singular. It is not the fruits of the Spirit, but fruit of the Spirit. And this simply means that what we're describing here are just various aspects of a singular fruit that is produced in the life of a Christian. It would be like me describing my favorite fruit. I would describe it as being red, it has a stem, it has a skin, it has core, it has seeds. I'm not describing different fruits. I'm describing a single fruit, just different aspects of what we call an apple. And that's what Paul is describing here. A single fruit that is produced in the lives of Christians, just in its various aspects. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and so forth. Now the third thing that we need to note about this phrase, the fruit of the Spirit, is the figure of speech itself implies growth, doesn't it? When we think of fruit, we think of something that grows. If I were to go down to the nursery and purchase a peach tree and bring it home this evening and plant it out back and water it and apply certain nutrients to it and go to bed, it would be ridiculous for me to get up in the morning and think that I could go out there and there would be ripe peaches on that tree, ready for me to pick and eat. There's growth involved. And growth involves two things, time and nutrients. And the same thing is true spiritually. In order for the Spirit to produce these qualities in our lives, there's time involved and there's also nutrients involved. And the nutrients in the Christian life that helps the Spirit to produce these qualities are things like prayer, meditation, Bible study, worship, fellowship. When the Spirit is present in our lives, it takes these nutrients, and when it has the freedom to work in our lives, it's able to use them to bring forth this fruit within our lives. Now, with that in mind, let's look quickly at the various aspects of the fruit of the Spirit. First of all, love. God himself is love. 1 John chapter 4, verse 8. He is agape. That's what he is in his very nature. That's his quality. If there was a word that we could use to describe God, perhaps it would be that word. And agape love is a love that is totally selfless. It is concerned about the needs of others rather than the needs of oneself. It is a love that gives itself expecting nothing in return. It expects no recognition and no reward. And that is really a love that's sort of foreign to us, isn't it? Most of the love that we even extend to those who are closest to us is a love that sort of has strings attached. Sometimes around the home, parents will chasten their children by saying, "How can you talk to me this way when you consider all the things that I've done for you?" And sometimes husbands and wives will talk about one another and say, well, I'd be more loving to him, or I'd be more loving toward her if he or she would be a little more considerate, would help a little more, and would be a little bit more cooperative. There is a way in our thinking in which we think that as we extend love, we expect some type of response from that. But agape love isn't given based upon the guarantee of that response. It rejoices in the giving rather than in the receiving. It does not require a guaranteed return on investment. And so it allows you to meet the needs of others without keeping a record or without worrying about what they now owe you in return. I think of this time of year, isn't it always the case? Somebody gives you a present this time of year and you immediately think, well, now I got to go out and give them a present. And they gave me a present. And this is going back and forth. Agape love doesn't keep records like that. It just sees needs in the lives of others and it responds to those. Then there's joy. Almost everyone laughs. It has happy moments on occasions from time to time. But precious few know anything about the experience of real joy, the type of joy that's described here as a dimension of the fruit of the Spirit. This is a joy that does not come and go. It is something that abides, and it stems from an internal relationship with the living Lord. Christian joy is an inner contentment and a quiet satisfaction that the changing circumstances of life cannot diminish or destroy. Paul could rejoice when he saw hundreds respond to the gospel of Jesus Christ, and he could also rejoice in Christian joy in the middle of a prison. The changing circumstances didn't have an impact on his experience of genuine joy. You have joy in your life? Are you able to rejoice in the things that are now happening in your life? Some of you can't because you're not walking by the Spirit, not surrendering at this particular point to the Spirit, to Jesus. Joy more than anything else is a result. It is a result of knowing that your life is in the very center of the will of God. And so that simply means that if you took a spiritual assessment of your life now and you discovered, I have not that quality of joy that's described here, that would suggest that there's some area of your life that you are withholding from the control of the Lord. It's time to take spiritual inventory. It's time to determine where is that area or areas that I still need to surrender to Him, for until you surrender those areas, you can't experience the depth and the quality of joy that is a dimension of the fruit of the Spirit. And then there's peace. The Bible reveals two kinds of peace that we can know as children of God. Peace with God and the peace of God. Peace with God comes at conversion. Because of sins, we become the enemies of God. There's a division. We're in opposition to Him and to His will. And yet God has taken action to undo what we have done, so that He sent His Son into this world to restore peace to those who would turn to Him. We read in Romans chapter 5, verse 1, therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. And so we can have that peace with God through Jesus. As we become Christians, though, and as we walk by the Spirit, we can also become or come to the point that we experience the peace of God. That is an inner tranquility and an inner stability and an inner confidence that you and I can have in the midst of this confusing and falling apart world of ours. You know, reading the newspaper this morning should remind every one of us that we live in a threatening world. We live in a world which, if you look at a map from the Middle East to Central America and to the islands of the Pacific, there are wars and conflicts that rage and that threaten us. Famines take thousands of lives daily, while the world population continues to increase at an unprecedented rate. They don't know how they're going to feed the world in the year 2000. Epidemic diseases like AIDS continue to run out of control. And then there's crime and terrorism and recession and depression and political scandal and the breakup of a home and a host of other things, all of which are representative of a world that has within itself the seeds of its own self-destruction. It's enough to make a person wonder, how are we going to deal with the future? And many are asking that question. How do you cope in times like these? How do you retain your sanity? The pressure and the pace and the stress and the strain are taking their toll. And everywhere there's evidence of people who are finding it difficult to deal with what life is dealing them. In desperation, they are searching for an escape in a few moments of sensual pleasure. Or they're trying an escape in a bottle of alcohol, or maybe the escape that another high of cocaine will offer. Sometimes they even take their own lives just to bring an end to their worries and their despairs and their heartaches. In contrast to this, the Spirit of God offers peace. Not an escape from what threatens us. Not an escape from an environment that at times seems to be almost out of control, but an inner confidence that God is working out His will. And we will wait for God to work out His purposes in the midst of life's most challenging times. Then there is the dimension of patience. Macrothumia, a compound Greek word. Broken down, it simply means macro, long, thumia, tempered, long-tempered. It's the very opposite of our English expression, short-tempered. When the Spirit of the living Lord has His way within us, what we learn from this is that we lose our tendency to be short-fused with both people and with circumstances. That's a tall order, isn't it? Every one of us from time to time have difficulty at the point of controlling our tempers. Being impatient, though, toward people or events is not a mark of spiritual maturity. It indicates the presence of the flesh. However, at times we play games with one another, play games with ourselves, make excuses for ourselves. When we lose our temper, lose control in a particular situation, we follow it with, well, I've always had a bad temper. Or sometimes I say things that I don't really mean. Well, that's granted. We do that. But God is looking for more than just our recognition. He's looking for our submission at this particular point. So that if you fly off the handle easily, if people know me or they know you as someone who has a short fuse, then that's a time when we need to get along with God and we need to surrender our temper to Him. You ever done that? In prayer, surrender a temper to Him. That's what He's asking you to do. And then you develop this quality of patience in your life. Then there's kindness. Kindness expresses the attitude of willingness to meet the needs of others. Like these other qualities, it finds its source in God. And perhaps we can best understand the characteristics of kindness, of this particular quality, by looking at the kindness of God and of its characteristics. The Bible teaches us that the kindness of God is first of all universal. He withholds His kindness from no one. In Luke chapter 6, verse 35, Jesus said, "Love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. For He Himself is kind to the ungrateful and evil men." There's a universality to the kindness of God. He withholds it from no one. He does not send His kindness with strings attached. He doesn't say, "I'll stop being kind if you don't respond to what I have to say." He just keeps on being kind. Matthew chapter 5, verse 45, He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain to the righteous and the unrighteous. So God's kindness is universal. But to quickly add to that, God's kindness is redemptive. There's a reason why He's kind to all. There's a reason why He shows no favor in His kindness, because He desires to save all. So that in Romans chapter 2, verse 4, Paul asks, "Or do you not think lightly of the riches of His kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that the kindness of God leads you to repentance?" God shows kindness to all because He seeks to save all. So God's kindness is both universal and it is redemptive. And that should tell us something about what our kindness should resemble and how it should manifest itself as the Spirit works this out in our lives. For you see, when the Spirit really moves into our lives to produce this sort of kindness, we will lose the sinful tendency to be insensitive and uncaring toward others. And we will find this replaced by a willingness and a determination to reach out to help others. I really believe that we should not sit back and let government agencies take over the front lines in the war against drug abuse and poverty and hunger and broken homes and the like. If there's any place that the people of our community should know that they can go to find help, to get a teenager off drugs, it ought to be the Lord's church. They ought to be able to know there's a resource there, or they can send me to a resource, and they can help me. The place where the street people and the hungry are fed should be overseen by Christians rather than non-Christian service groups. The place where divorced people should find help in putting their lives back together should be, above all places, the local body of believers. The place in the community most known by the community as a group of people who really care and who really help the littlest and the least should be the place that dares to be identified as the Church of Christ. We ought to show a willingness and a readiness to help others, to be kind toward others. For when we begin to be known for our kindness, our consideration, and our concern, then God will use this in a redemptive way to draw people to Himself. The Greek word for goodness is a difficult one to define. It's so broad. But basically, it kind of moves between the areas of generosity and big-heartedness. Goodness is that which goes beyond fairness. When we treat someone fairly, we give them what they deserve. I'll give you an example. A person who uses illegal drugs deserves to go to jail for it. That's the law of the land. And in fact, it would be fair to sentence them to the maximum that the law would allow for that particular crime. That would be fairness, justice in that particular situation. But goodness is that which goes beyond fairness. It concentrates on helping the person, on benefiting the person, and on enabling that person to get back on the right track in life again. Goodness acts as one of those sort of balancing qualities in the Christian life. There's a story told about T.B. Larimore, a man who came to one of his meetings and who was converted during the meeting. This individual had attended a number of other gospel meetings and heard many gospel sermons. After his conversion, someone asked, "Why did you respond to the gospel after hearing it proclaimed by Brother Larimore when you hadn't responded before?" And the man's answer is itself a great lesson. He responded by saying, "From other preachers I'd learned that I was going to hell for my sins, but they seemed almost pleased that I was. From Larimore I learned that I was lost, but I could tell it broke his heart to have to tell me so." There's the goodness. And day by day, as we leave this place tonight, as we leave this area this week, we're going back to places where there are people who are hurting and embarrassed and struggling and distressed and depressed and confused, and they need a fresh breath of air to come in their lives. Christian goodness. They will help them to see the light of the Lord and the way to it. Then faithfulness. Briefly, faithfulness is just simply dependability. We live in a world which perhaps has as one of its characteristics the characteristic of fickleness. People who let the flesh dominate do not have the ability to be consistent and to be dependable. And so they walk away from marriages. They give up on problem children. They run away from financial agreements, from friendships and job assignments, because to them serving self and pleasing self is more important than carrying through with a commitment. In contrast with that, the Christian life should be marked by reliability, dependability, faithfulness. We should allow the Holy Spirit to replace our fickleness with faithfulness, dependability. For some of us, that might be a tough assignment. Some of you may find that this will involve staying with a congregation when it seems like no one appreciates your service at that congregation. It may mean commitment to a spouse who seems to be intent on making your life miserable. Others may find that dependability demands that you refuse not to give up on a rebellious child who's already broken your heart over 100 times. Trustworthiness or faithfulness may mean doing your best on homework assignments, or on paying bills on time, or on keeping appointments as scheduled, or on fulfilling various responsibilities associated with the local church. All of these would fall under the area of faithfulness and dependability. And that ought to mark our lives as we walk by the Spirit. And there's gentleness. Gentleness combines two ideas, really: toughness and tenderness. Again, it's one of those balance terms. It's not a weak word. It's a word that combines these two qualities, toughness and tenderness. You see, if we move too much in the direction of one or the other, we lose that balance. For instance, in our treatment of others, if we lean too much on the side of toughness, we may tend to be cold or intolerant. On the other hand, if we lean more in our treatment of others toward the side of tenderness, we may tend toward compromise and timidity. What gentleness helps us to do is to find that mean between that balance between that, so we are tender at the right times and tough at the right times when we need to be, to face the difficult assignments that God has given to us. We've listed some of these in the book. They include, when we sit down to study God's Word, we are to do so in a spirit of gentleness, James chapter 1, verse 21. When we confront others with their sin, we are to do so with the spirit of gentleness, Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. When we face personal opposition, it should be with a spirit of gentleness, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 25. When we defend the faith, it should be in this same spirit, 1 Peter chapter 3, 15. And then we should be marked with gentleness when we live our lives before men, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 4. Now the last of these dimensions of the fruit of the Spirit, self-control. This is the power to restrain urges and appetites that could ruin and destroy us. Restraint, again, is one of those words you don't hear much about today. In fact, if you get your theology or your philosophy about life from bumper stickers and billboards, you hear more of this: tell it like it is, don't hold back, go for it. You don't hear much about restraint. A lack of restraint in life will lead to ruination, though. I remember in 7th grade, I was riding my bicycle home from school and didn't have my hands on the handlebars. I could balance myself without that, moving right along. I thought I had total control of the situation until I lost control of the situation, wrecked the bike, dislocated a shoulder. I thought that, you didn't need to have that strict control there, but I learned through a painful way that it's best to exercise the control that the situation calls for. The same is true in our lives, isn't it? There's a place for self-control. Why restrain your sexuality, your desire for wealth, your push for power, your anger, your language, your thoughts? Because if you don't, there'll be a lot of pain involved, a lot of problems. And you will leave behind you a trail of broken hearts and broken homes and broken lives because you did not exercise self-control. The fruit of the Spirit is self-control. Well, Galatians chapter 5, beginning verse 16, calls us to walk by the Spirit. It's not an easy walk. It is a struggle. It is a battle. But as we are willing to surrender and as we are willing to submit, God promises us spiritual victory and spiritual fruitfulness. Do you desire victory? Do you desire spiritual fruitfulness? Do you want these qualities to begin to manifest themselves in your life and deepen and grow in your life? Then the key is surrender. Absolute submission. Nothing held back. As Paul writes as he concludes this section in verse 25, if we live by the Spirit, let us also walk by the Spirit.